Well, so let's kick it off. I'm here with Matt Maletta, the General Counsel of Endo Pharmaceuticals, and really delighted to have this conversation with Matt. He has done so many interesting things, and I hope to kind of tease out, like we've done with other great leaders, kind of how that trajectory was created. So welcome, Matt. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really happy to be here.
So you grew up in Minnesota, if I did my research correctly, and you've meandered from coast to coast. Can you talk a little bit about how you grew up and how that kind of influenced where you've come out today?
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting because I grew up in Minnesota, but my family is from the East Coast, and so we were a little bit, out of place in the Minnesota kind of mindset. My father's from northern New Jersey and my mother's from Pittsburgh. And so particularly in my father's case, where he had come from a place called Paterson, New Jersey, which is not a very nice area, but sort of created through his own determination his life, became a very successful physician, and was very quick for us at a young age to basically make us believe we could do anything we wanted to. So that kind of foundation every day, understanding what goes into that, and the hard work and the discipline that's associated with achieving things you want to achieve was something that has been a part of my life since I was very young. And my mother was the perfect fit, for him, coming from Western Pennsylvania, which is a lot of steel towns and the like. And so she was, very similar in kind of frugality, discipline, understanding, kind of what it takes, but also understanding you can do anything. So, I knew from a young age I wanted to be a lawyer. I knew I wasn't going to, play for the Yankees, and I knew it was sort of in line with my own, enjoyment, I guess, of advocating. And so my father was very good about forcing us to take and defend issues at dinner every night. And, he just was such a great, brilliant person. And I developed a love of advocacy just to have those debates with him, because it was a time where I could be with him and build that relationship with him. And then, of course, when I got to college, it was really about trying to get the right grades, for the young people, and trying to be in a position where I could get to where I wanted to go and get to law school. So it was I really owe it to my parents and kind of the lessons they instilled to, put me in a platform where I could succeed as a lawyer.
I love that. I was a policy debater in high school and college, so we had that same mindset in our home, and we carry it on today. In fact, some have observed maybe to the extreme. Everything is kind of a nuanced discussion, but I do think it's a great way to learn, and it's a great way to learn how to learn both sides of an issue, because if you don't know both sides, you can't be an effective advocate if you don't give credit to the other side. So that's really interesting. You ended up at a couple of great firms. You started at Skadden. Tell me a little bit about that.
Actually, it's a funny story because I, again, going to the young people in your firm, I've given this speech at my old law school when I've been invited back, and it was really about not believing what I call the haves or the have-nots in law school, where, pretty quickly into your second or third year, the haves know who they are and the have-nots know who they are, and in terms of job offers and opportunities. And so I was sort of in between. I had done really well as an undergrad. When I got to law school, I was if I had taken a couple of years off, that probably would have been good for me. But I got to law school, I was doing well enough, but not really where I wanted to be in terms of where I could get into the firms that would have been where I wanted to be. And so I ended up actually reaching out to a law firm on my own at the time that was really small, based in Wayzata, Minnesota, which is outside of Minneapolis. And it was on Lake Minnetonka, which to me was the selling point of this law firm, because it had a beautiful view of the lake. and I found that the partners lived on the lake, so they must be doing something right. So I wrote a letter to the transactional partner and basically just said, look, and I wrote this, I will, quote, sweep the floor if you give me an opportunity, and I'll make you so happy that you did. And so the guy called me a couple of days later and he said, look, I'm not hiring anybody, but anybody who writes me a letter like that, I want to have lunch with that guy. So I'm going to take you to lunch. So we went to lunch, and 2 hours later at the end of the lunch, he had offered me a job. And so it was really based on, and I try to bring this now, energy and sort of passion for the opportunity. And I ended up working there for a year and a half, and then got a call from a headhunter in Chicago who was, at the time the economy had improved. This was 1998. And Skadden and Kirkland and some of the other firms were looking for, laterals. And so I went down there, interviewed with all of them, and really wanted Skadden because that was, to me, was, with my father being from New York, and I really loved the New York, firm, that was really the one I wanted, and went into the interview and had to have a game plan around my grades not being, straight A's and for the first couple of years I was in law school. And so really tried to connect with the partners as people in each of the interviews. And again, bring the passion and bring the energy around what I thought I could do for them from a pure service perspective if I were to get this opportunity. And, they made me an offer, and I joined the firm and spent almost 2 years there, and really only left because of a personal circumstance in my life where I wanted to relocate to Colorado, and ended up leaving Skadden and joining Brobeck, which at the time was a real, high flyer in the 2000 timeframe. We had about 700 or 800 lawyers, and the firm was doing really well. But it was always with the mindset that I was going to try to go back to Skadden once I sort of got my feet back under me. In any case, 9/11 happened while I was still at Brobeck, and Skadden had called me 2 weeks earlier and asked me to come back. And I told them I was thinking about it. And then 9/11 happened, and they put a hiring freeze on, and I was really a little concerned because Brobeck at that time started to have problems with, the old line clients they weren't servicing, and the new clients, the .coms, were going under. And by pure happenstance, I was in a friend's office who was an associate, and he had been looking for his landing, which was going to be at Latham in Orange County, where he had interviewed in law school. And the partner had just emailed him back, and I was standing in his office, and he said, look, we're not hiring. Latham's not hiring either, but our biggest client in Orange County is looking for a corporate person. I think you're probably too junior, but let me know if you're interested. And he read me that email while I stood in his office. And I said, well, hey, are you interested in that? Because if you're not, I think I am. And he said, I don't really want to go in-house, so I'm really not, I guess I'm really not. So I took it upon myself to go back again, similar theme here, to go back, and I emailed the partner, a guy named Kerry Hyden, who's based in Orange County, still at Latham, and said, hey, listen, I know you don't know me. I'm, kind of stalking you, but I'm a friend of the guy you emailed. And I would love to, have a chance for this opportunity. And so by pure chance, I just happened to be opposite Latham on a deal at that time. And Carrie, who's a very diligent person, sort of gave me a soft email back like, hey, if you're ever in LA, let me know. But, good luck to you. But then he actually followed up and called the partner. I had mentioned in the email that I was opposite Latham on a deal. He actually called that partner and said, hey, what do you think of this kid? And the partner said good things about me, that I was a hard worker and et cetera. And so Kerry, and he wrote me back again. And I said, hey, I'm going to be in LA in a week on this closing. And he said, let's have breakfast. So I drove down to Newport Beach, where I had never been. And we had a 2.5-hour breakfast, similar to the other story. And at the end of that, it was really, he said, hey, look, I'm conflicted because we have somebody in my office who's really close to getting this job, but I really think you're a good fit for the general counsel at Allergan. Here's his name and number. His name's Doug Ingram. Call him. And so I did that. And knowing Doug now for the last 18 years, of course, I didn't hear back from him because that's Doug. But then he called me when I thought I wasn't getting the job, and I'd sort of moved on and was thinking about transferring to Brobeck's LA office. And he said, can you be here tomorrow morning for an interview? I mean, it was that kind of a call. I flew to Orange County, met with him, met with everybody. He called me the next day and said, like, you're way too young for this job. I don't think you're ready for it. The other guy's way better. He's got way more experience. But I really love your energy, and I want to have you on the team. So I'm going to make you the offer. I don't know how much money it is. I don't know any of that stuff. And I need you here in like 4 days. So it was that fast that I packed up my 4Runner and drove from Denver, where I was, to Orange County, got an apartment, and literally started at Allergan, I think 2 or 3 days later. thought I would be there for a couple of years until things again settled down in the post 9/11 world, and I was able to get back to a law firm. And I was there for almost 14 years until we sold the company. So it ended up being a very lucky, opportunistic thing for me to join Allergan. And of course, the company went from, when I got there, I think the market cap of the company was around 10 billion, and we sold the company for 72 or 73 billion in 2015. And so when that happened, I was out of a job and ended up taking the job at Endo, which at the time was a $95 stock, was doing great. And, was just really, during the interview, I'm a corporate lawyer. I had no real litigation experience other than some, sort of cats and dogs. And I got to Endo and have really had to do litigation for the past 5 years, pretty much, every single day. So that's been a real, to your earlier point, a real flip from being transactional on the Allergan, corporate securities and M&A side to being at Endo and being the general counsel and being mostly, I'd say 80% of my time is spent doing, from settling the mesh litigation when I first got there, which was 72,000 cases, to testosterone replacement therapy, mass torts, to settlements with the FTC, to suing the FDA. And we actually won that case, which was fantastic, to, securities class actions, to, of course, the biggest litigation in the U.S. is the opioid litigation. We're one of the 6 or 7 manufacturing defendants among the, call it 20 really key defendants throughout the whole thing. But it's been crazy.
Well, thank you. That's a great overview. And I want to pull back on a couple of threads, but one comment you made is something pretty consistent with what I hear from people who work with you, that you're very driven, you're very engaging. And talk a little bit about, here you are coming from this small firm in Minnesota, going to Skadden, trying to get a job. Talk a little bit about some of the things, even if you look back on the Matt of 23 or 4 years ago, what was it that worked, and what would you change about that Matt based on what you now know, being a client and being very successful in a law firm?
Well, I think the biggest thing for me was, when I went to that small firm, the biggest thing I learned was if you want something done, you have to do it yourself. And it was something you always hear as a kid growing up. But I really learned how to be a lawyer by being in a law firm of 6 people. And that meant I had clients who were sole proprietors to clients who were, call it 150, 200 people, small companies, where, you are the one getting it done. You're writing the brief. You're drafting the agreement. You're making the phone calls. You don't have administrative help. So you become very self-sufficient. And you become, a partner with those clients. So when I got to Skadden, a couple of the things I took away were, I remember at the time when one of the more senior associates was sitting in an office, and he called me to have me walk down to his office so that I could then find an admin to make his copies and fax something for him. And I just thought, this is exactly sort of I would have just walked out of my office and done it. It was right across the hall from where he was sitting, by the way. But he called me down from another place. We had to then find somebody, And so what I took away was really, doing things yourself and being efficient and being on it is probably the most important attribute. So from from the old version of myself, I think it was the drive and sort of I'll do anything. I'll do whatever it takes to be here. Never forgetting that even now. And that is something that I try to, instill with the external counsel and also my own team. I have no use for managers, and I've never considered myself a manager. My first day I was representing somebody. I had no idea what I was doing. Then I got to Skadden, and I went from the story I tell people is it's like playing in an independent baseball league in Iowa, and then the New York Yankees call you and say, you're going to start tomorrow night at Yankee Stadium against the Red Sox. I mean, you have no idea what you're walking into. And that was obvious for the first few months I was there. Again, it came back to go inside yourself, understand that you can do this and believe in yourself, and then do whatever it takes. And that means staying all overnight. That means, making sure everything's read 4 times to make sure it's as close to perfection as it can get. That means anticipating the partner's needs and the client's needs and acting on that so that there's nothing that you haven't already thought of. And so I'm not going to lie, that was a tough adjustment for me to actually operationalize that every day, even though it sounds good. So when I got to Skadden, I had some growing pains when I got there. I was also away from Minnesota for the first time really in my life. And I was adjusting to all sorts of different things. But the drive was the most important thing, to do anything it takes. But I think some of the immaturity, in terms of you get a little bit bull in a china shop sometimes to get things done. And I think back then, partners were a little more like that too. I think thankfully the practice has gotten a little more, particularly within the law firms, a little more humane. And so I think that I came from a model working for people at Skadden that was very much, you're cannon fodder, and I was happy to be cannon fodder given where I had come from. But I think that rubbed off on me a little bit when I got to an in-house position where I had to adjust again to the fact that you're not here to tell people what to do. You're here to listen and you're here to help and support people. And so I had to transition when I got to Allergan. Now, of course, there's a time and a place. And I worked for a CEO, David Pyott, who is, Harvard Business School ranked him, I think, the number 4, number 5 CEO in the world, bar none, in terms of size of company and industry. And he's a legend. He's amazing. But his expectations were, perfection. And David was going to tell you something one time, and, he wasn't going to explain it to you. He was going to tell you what he wanted, and you had to figure it out. And so having the sort of understanding, the emotional intelligence, not to pester him, to do the best I could to go to find ways to figure out what he wanted when I first really got to work with him. And ultimately, we worked together for all the years I was at Allergan, and we're still very close. Understanding my role as kind of a service role for him and for the board and for, the executive committee was also important in terms of understanding. And I got that again from my family, understanding, people don't work for you. You're here to serve, and you're happy to be in the room, and you're happy to be part of the team. And that's really what it all comes down to. And I think so that's really been something that I've tried to keep focus on with my own department, but also in terms of people I hire, in terms of how I engage with outside lawyers. I really think some of the ways that some general counsels act with their outside counsel is really kind of commoditizing them. And that is just not at all how and again, I not only did I learn a lot from David, I'd be totally remiss if I didn't say that Doug Ingram, who is now the CEO of Sarepta in Boston, and has done really, really well for himself. He was an incredible, and is still, I was texting with him last night, an incredible mentor. He believed in, treating external counsel the way you want to be treated, not haggling over nickels and dimes and bills, because you want external counsel to want to pick up your file, to want to work with you. Building relationships with external counsel that are human, where these people, their families, you build, and they know yours. You build that kind of real, authentic bond with people. That's just human. That people work better and want to win for people they like and they respect and they want to hang out with. It becomes personal to somebody where they're representing your company, but they're a personal friend. And I try to really build those relationships with people. And I've been with most of the external counsel I've worked with since I joined Allergan, and some of the people that I used to work with at Skadden when I was an associate are still representing Endo today. So it's you build those long-term relationships, and it's just awesome.
No, it is. I mean, there's so many points I want to pick up on, but there's a lot of humility. I mean, there's a lot of what I'm hearing you say is a little bit. It helped that you came from a smaller firm in Minnesota, moving to Skadden. Nothing was too small. I took over our business development team, and we created values. And one of the values comes from the All Blacks, sweep the floor, right? That when they went into a visitor locker room, they would sweep the floor to leave it at least as good as they found it. And I think that servant mentality, that humility is such an important factor. I hear that over and over when I talk to really great leaders, that they are there there for service, not to self-promote, not to be the smartest person in the room. They may be the smartest person in the room, but that's not that's not their why. So really fascinating. Talk a little bit about David Pyott, because I didn't expect really necessarily to go into that, but you're right. You got to work with somebody who is legendary. What made him legendary? Can you talk a little bit about him?
Yeah, absolutely. And David is somebody that I worked with from my first day at Allergan. When I attended the board meeting on my first day, and again, had never been in a public company boardroom in my life. And here I was, 3 seats away from him. And I spent the next 13 years sitting right next to him. I was very fortunate to be the secretary to the board of Allergan for 5 years and the assistant secretary for, 10 before that, or 8 before that. But David, what made David so great was a couple of things. You talk about humility. David is the most humble. When he walks into a room, he's just the nicest, most humble person in the room. And it was something that was just kind of core to who he is. And it may be because he grew up in many different countries, and he was, he's very international. But I think it's just inherent to who he is his humility, also his preparation, which is unbelievable. So 13 years of being next to him, I would come into meetings with him, and his preparation of having read every document before the meeting and notated it, and having thoughtful questions and insights during every meeting. I mean, he treated every meeting the same way. And he never took one off. Like you talk about, NFL guys taking a play off. David never took a meeting off. I mean, he was always as prepared as he was for the most important board meeting he would be for an Allergan Foundation meeting or a meeting on HR, policy or whatnot. In 2010, he actually made me the head of HR for 6 months at Allergan. So I got to reported directly to David outside my board role. And I really got to know him as a person at that point as well, because my office was right next to his. And so, every day he would come in, and just his look at a set of facts was also a little bit different, and a little bit, everything was an insight to him. It wasn't just data. He had a view on things and how that was going to potentially impact Allergan, or how Allergan could potentially impact a situation. He obviously foresaw the medical aesthetics, boom when he invested heavily in Botox and, built that company into what it became, and which is legendary. The other thing I got to work on with him was when the Valeant Pershing Square thing they tried to do a hostile on us, which was a very, very large hostile. I think it was $50 billion was their initial offer, and we sold the company for 70. But the day that happened was April of 2014. And at that time, what was interesting was David was, at that point, he'd been CEO for about 17 years and was, getting ready for the next chapter of his life. And we had sort of a succession plan figured out within the company. And, all of that got sort of blown up the day that the Valeant thing started. But what I saw there from him was a couple of other important traits. One was absolute calm in the face of crazy, because immediately that day, it was on CNBC every morning. He was being accused of being entrenched. He was accused of scorched earth. We had the Bill Ackman, PR campaign going against us every morning. And I have some funny Bill Ackman stories during that 7-month process. But David was so calm and so resolute in his belief that they were undervaluing the company. I mean, I was on calls with him and with key shareholders at the time who were adamant that he sit down with Valeant and negotiate, and who also owned Valeant shares. So part of the strategy was to illustrate that the currency that Valeant was offering in terms of the shares that they were offering as that part of the merger consideration was not as predictable, I guess, as cash, and was not reliable. And so David was highlighting for the market his view that Valeant had long-term value problems. And so that caused a lot of friction with some key shareholders, because they also owned Valeant. And when David would make comments like that, it would impact the Valeant stock. That was never his goal, but it happened. And I was on some calls with him and other board members that were really roller coasters, but he was resolute and he was certain that he was right. And no matter what happened, he never went into sort of a crisis panic mode. He was methodical, prepared, calm, strategic, all the things you would want, and ultimately ended up selling the company for about $25 billion more than Valeant had offered initially. So it turned out that and then of course we all know what happened to Valeant down the road. It was not long after we signed the deal with Actavis and closed that Valeant's problems emerged. And I think their stock went from 140 or something down to, I think, like $10 or something like that. I mean, so David was right. He was proven absolutely right.
Yeah, it's that preparation and stoicism. I'm a history reader, and Chernow's book on Grant, I'd had it on my night table, and I finally kind of picked it back up. And he's, come back into vogue for his, his stoic attributes, both as a military person and, some of that went into his preparation, but a lot of it was just his ability to have clarity when everything around him was blowing up. It sounds, that stoicism that you read about, it sounds like David had that. That's fascinating. I was going to ask about that takeover. I'd love to hear you share a Bill Ackman story. I'm sure there's some of our listeners who would find that humorous or interesting.
Well, Bill Ackman, the first day that happened, the way I found out about that was my admin came in and said, hey, one of our partners at Latham is on the phone and needs to talk to you. And I was literally in a meeting with 3 people. And I said, well, I'm kind of tied up right now. And she's like, no, he said, you need to stop whatever you're doing and get on the phone. And so I got on and he said, basically turn on CNBC, Valeant and Ackman are coming for Allergan. And so it was not 15, 20 minutes later, I had a call from Bill Ackman, which I wasn't able to take, but I had a voicemail from him and that made it very real. Nevertheless, my view of Bill Ackman was, Bill was doing what he does. And, I didn't have any, animosity. I actually respect, he's trying to create value for his investors and, we were trying to create value for our shareholders. And, so I tried to actually build a relationship with him. And I think that he and I had a pretty spirited debate outside the courtroom in Orange County when we were doing the hearing on the preliminary injunction. He ended up following me into the bathroom to continue the debate, which was the funny story. We only had 10 minutes and I was like, hey, I gotta hit the restroom. He's like, I'm going in there with you. And, and so it was real.
LBJ stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. But he was doing the best he could for his people. And, ultimately, it ended up the way it did. But I don't have any, I respect him and his business and what he's trying to accomplish. And, still was trying to text him and we'd occasionally text after the whole thing was over. And it was important to have somebody within Allergan have a direct line to him because it was in my role as the secretary, that was really what that was. But also the way the setup was from David's perspective that, only David was going to speak for the board. So whether Bill Ackman or other investors were reaching out to other board members, they weren't going to have a substantive conversation with other board members. So I was sort of in a role of being an intermediary with some of those folks and the board in my role as board secretary.
What a powerful experience. And I'm kind of like back at your parents' dinner table and having you learn the lesson that you can be on an opposite side of an issue from somebody without demonizing them or hating them or dropping ad hominems. That's really terrific.
It happens sometimes for all of us. There are some people that are just unreasonable, and they're usually the ones that are not the Bill Ackmans of the world. Bill Ackman is a capitalist, and he's interested in value creation. There are some folks on the lawyer side, I think, more often than the investor side, who are interested in pounding the table, and that can just be hard to deal with sometimes, particularly in some of the situations we've been in at Endo with, opioids, for example, or mesh settlements or some of the other things we've had to deal with.
In a way, it is an act of disrespect to the other person that they're not absorbing, what it is that you're telling them and that they need so much emotion behind it. It's a great lesson.
I've never understood that, and look, people who know me, I can get really fired up. But my being really fired up comes, I think, more from a sense of people not being practical. And there is no one likes to get sued, and the plaintiffs don't like to settle for numbers that they don't want. I mean, so no one's particularly happy with an outcome. But that's our job. I think sometimes as lawyers is to be practical and quote unquote get real with what's going on. And whether that's on the defense side in my world, where you need to explain to the board or explain to a CEO why you need to settle something or why you need more money for something, or on the plaintiff side where maybe you're not going to get $20 billion for your claim, and you should be reasonable in terms of getting something done that lets everybody move on. And that sometimes is a challenge. I mean, I've been on the receiving end of this now for 5 years every day, and I mean that between mesh and testosterone and the government investigations and opioids, it's most of my day is on phone calls with people representing us, but people on the other side of the table are asking for things that are existential, right? I mean, one expert in one case wants billions of dollars, and we have thousands of cases. So, how do you resolve that case without creating more cases that are just like it, without harming your own company? I mean, there's all these different things going on all the time. It is very challenging, but having great external counsel and advisors, like your firm and other firms is incredibly key to the success of any general counsel or anybody who's in-house.
So I do want to talk about the opioid litigation. I mean, it's the tobacco litigation of 2020, right? I mean, it's now being attributed to all these deaths, and there've been big settlements with governmental entities. You've entered into some settlements with governmental entities. Talk a little bit. I mean, I don't want to get into things. You're actively involved in these cases, so we don't want to share strategy that is sensitive. But in terms of looking at how you're managing, especially as a transactional lawyer by background, what are some principles that you use in your leadership on the team on the opioid litigation?
Well, I think the first and foremost part of that is energy and passion, because this is a slog, and you have to, and not taking yourself too seriously. I generally, and people give me a hard time about this on my own team, but I'll get on the phone and it's 5 or 10 minutes. How are people's weekends and what's going on? And, going back to my earlier point of making sure people understand how valued they are. And then when it's 6 months in, or in this case, we're 3 years into this litigation. And, I was on a call an hour ago with the team, making sure that you're bringing the kind of energy that you want to see from them, participating in the calls, asking questions, saying thank you, simple, basic principles of not getting on people for foot faults, because they're going to happen. And the idea that you're going to, sort of come down on your external counsel or even somebody on your internal team about something that doesn't really create a problem is just short-sighted. It's just bad leadership. This is not a battle. This is a war. That's the first principle, is bringing that energy and enthusiasm. Also, having looked at the documents, being thoughtful about it, going back to the David Pyott thing, being prepared. I'm not a litigator, and I say that all the time on the phone. So I've sort of stopped apologizing in advance for the quote unquote silly idea I'm going to throw out about how to, what motion we should bring. And I think people know they can laugh in my face about it. And, the ideas I have are bad. They're bad. It's a bad idea. So, okay. Let's move on. But maybe every once in a while there's one that isn't terrible, and that they can sort of build around. But it's mostly just trying to tease out how people are thinking. What is the strategy? Where are we trying to get here? How are we making sure that we have as positive of a position as we can in terms of the overall pack with opioids? Because, you have different, as you have different people in the supply chain, whether they're manufacturers, distributors, pharmacies in both a dispensing and a distribution role, physicians, all sorts of folks that are involved in the supply chain who are defendants. And, they have different kind of liabilities potentially and different strategies. And it's not easy, but it's bearing in mind the overall strategy, but also making sure that we understand who we are. We're a smaller company in this. So I would, in cases where there's a lot of people involved, like New York, for example, I would rather be sort of coming along rather than trying to break ground and let the J&Js and the big three be kind of in a leadership position on this stuff. So now, of course, there are cases where they aren't involved and it's just us, or it's us and one or two other defendants, and you have to be more of in a leadership position within the defense group. But again, it really comes back to bringing that enthusiasm. And as you mentioned earlier, understanding you're not the smartest person. Our external litigators are rock star people. These are the leading lawyers in the country, whether they're former U.S. attorneys or, former, cabinet people or judges or whatever. I mean, I'm not telling these people what to do. That's not ever going to cross my mind. I try to learn as much as I can from them and make sure they're feeling like they're motivated to do the best they can, I think is really the important role, and appreciating what they're doing. I mean, these people are working crazy hours. They're giving up time away from their families and on behalf of Endo. And, frankly, this is, I think, far worse than the tobacco litigation from a complexity standpoint, because there you really had the states bringing the cases, and you had the states then fighting with the cities and counties over allocation, which ultimately is what the failure of that process is what led to where we are today, where cities and counties are bringing their own claims. And that creates a difficulty when you have, the states who are often represented by themselves, and then you have cities and counties who are represented by contingent fee counsel, and the dynamic that sets up between those groups can sometimes make it difficult to deal with one or the other or both, because they have sometimes different agendas. So it's a very complicated thing. And so, we have lawyers. I mean, I can't even tell you, I don't even know who a lot of these people are, but I do know the key folks. And I'm always telling them, I think it's incumbent on anyone in my role or within my department to always be telling them how grateful we are for their hard work. I'm also really blessed with a head of litigation who is Carrie Hazard. She was at Deckard for 22 years or 23 years before she joined Endo. And she's been with us for 4 years and really leads this. And she's just amazing. So getting out of her way is also it's on my daily checklist.
Yeah. Knowing what assets you have on your team and how to incent them and motivate them to do their best. I mean, what a great example of leading a big team like that, and a humble approach to litigation. I suspect I know a teeny bit about what you're experiencing, because I was for a number of years outside general counsel to the asbestos trust that was funded by Halliburton. So Halliburton put, call it $3 billion in the bank, and I represented the trustees that were dealing with how to. I suspect we have some friends in common on the plaintiff's bar. So
it's a small group.
It's a small group.
It's funny how they work with each other. There's a pecking order, and they all know each other. There's a sort of the shot callers, we all know how that, and you have to build relationships with them so that they can help you deal with some of the other people. It's really a world I had no idea. You always read about this in sort of John Grisham or whatever, but to actually come in from the transactional side and be in it is a much different experience.
It is, and they're worthy adversaries, and they're very passionate about what they're doing. And I think it's impressive. I think people will find it very interesting that that's how you look at your opponents. You don't look at your opponents with disrespect. You look at your opponents with respect, which makes you a formidable adversary. So I want to be mindful of your time, and we only have a few more minutes. So I want to ask you a few exit questions. You've talked very graciously about outside counsel throughout this conversation. What's the one thing that you would tell your younger self from a business development perspective? Oh my gosh, I could never, talk to Matt Maletta about business, or I could never understand how to get a client like Endo. What would you kind of advise yourself looking up at the career path from a business development perspective?
I think for the associates, and it is, I remember very well being an associate and being on the phone with the general counsel of some of the clients, and it was intimidating, because they were sort of the boss or whatever of the partner, that you're working for. And so I think what they should look for is opportunities to engage with the legal department directly of the client. It's a one thing I've learned, and again, having our joking around earlier about kind of being on the older side of a lot of this stuff, is the people that you're dealing with who are junior within an organization when you're an associate are the people in 10 years that have moved up and that are now, folks that are deciding where business goes. So building those relationships with everyone you meet within an organization, whether it's the general counsel trying to, because most of the time, I think it's important, again, for people in my role to know as many of the people who are associates on the team and understand them as well. But there is an opportunity to engage with the GCs directly, as long as the partner is okay with that. I think that's an important thing to make sure you're checking on, having that EQ, knowing that, but also building relationships with the people that are in the legal department who are not the GC, because those people are going to be GCs in a few years, and they're going to be the ones deciding where the work goes. And so I think that is something to be mindful of. You're almost building up the next generation in terms of as you move up the ranks within the law firm and as your colleagues move up the ranks within the corporation. My big thing is showing the client and your team that you're grateful to be there, and bringing that energy is just so important, and building relationships with people. Like, I tell young lawyers, you are not going to decide if you make partner or you become a GC. Somebody else is going to make that decision. And usually it's a lot of other people. So every time you interact with somebody, remember that. Try to remember that. It's not always easy because people can be difficult. And I'm sure we all can be difficult ourselves. But when you're interacting with people, I think to remember that you're building this network and this sort of capital in your brand of who you are with all these interactions. And someone can disagree with you and think that your position is insane, and we've all had that happen, but they may not think you're a jerk, and so later on they can say, hey, look, the guy was in a tough spot. His client was wrong. He was doing the best he could for the client, but he was a decent human being. I think that is an important thing to remember. And so those are the qualities. Really look for positive interaction with people, look to build relationships, and at all levels, and the business will then come, because people will think of you as somebody who's, and I would also be remiss, I'm cramming in everything I can here in the last minute for people, but be super responsive and proactive in your thinking, because, when someone emails me, you don't wait till the next day to get back to people. There's no, in my view, I try to be as immediately responsive as I can be to people, because they're waiting, and whether doesn't matter what level in the organization they are. If someone's waiting on me to get something done, I want to get it to them right away. And I think that's a good way to think about your interactions with people. They'll know whether you're right or wrong. A lot of what we do is not rocket science. You can get back to someone quickly and they can move on with their day, and they know you're not a roadblock. They know your value add. So it's really just building your brand across, the process, I guess, of being responsive, and the substance of being thoughtful, and then the kind of emotional side of being a positive kind of energetic force that's on the team. And that will be, I think, an important, and remembering, my CEO now and I are close. And our big joke that we have is, we're like Notre Dame. There are no names on the back of the jersey. All we care about is the organization. And, his big thing is this quote unquote one team philosophy, which I totally agree with. If you want to be successful in this space, there are a few quote unquote sacred cows out there that we all know who they are in the law firm world. But for the most part, the firm, and thinking of the firm and your relationships within the firm and your client will be the things that get you where you want to go, putting that first in your mind, and you're kind of secondary. If you want to be the alpha, go home and hang with your dog. You'll be the alpha. It's great. But go when you're at work, try to put yourself in the low ego, all about the organization kind of perspective. And I think it'll be very helpful.
Yeah, I read a book by Ryan Holiday. It sounds like you may read a little Ryan Holiday, but he wrote Ego is the Enemy. And it's this whole book about historical figures who were successful because they learned how to subvert their ego. And I love the Notre Dame. It's right. Get your name off the back of your jersey and figure out what your purpose is, and fight for that purpose, and things will happen. Good things will happen. It's such a Such a wonderful.
And I have not read that book, but I do. The other thing, I mean, one other thing I do is I read a lot of biographies, and I think that's another piece of advice I would give people. I tend to focus on U.S. history because it's just something I've always loved, and so I think you learn a lot about how admired people think when they're in situations, and a lot of those biographies, you could argue, hey, look, in college I had to read this stuff. I don't want to read it now because it's boring, but it's really not boring because, the human condition and situations people find themselves in that are real, like, World War II, you're reading about Roosevelt, or the Civil War, Grant, your comments. You're trying to understand how are these people making decisions in the situations they're in. And that understanding helps create a framework in people's own mind for, how they're going to make decisions. Because we live in some crisis. We as lawyers deal with crisis a lot. And, it may not be your company, but it's your client. And you want to have internalized that enough to really care about it. And so, having a framework of kind of historical framework in my mind of understanding how these people thought about things and approach things, and things that you may like and things you may dislike about how they operated are really interesting. So you can kind of, it really gives you an ability to pivot around and understand different personalities, which I think is also really, really helpful when you're engaging with boards of directors, because they're all very different, or CEOs who are different, or different types of lawyers, everybody.
No, you and I are kindred spirits in so many different ways. And I'm a huge biography reader. I love Chernow. I love I love a lot of the great biographers. Give us two, like if you were, somebody who wanted to learn about what we do a little more, what would be two off your bookshelf?
Well, the little twist on the end of the question is about what we do a little more, kind of moves me into the lawyer zone.
Yeah, you don't have to.
This is going to sound interesting and kind of weird, but I've read a lot of these, and I've been fascinated by Nixon just because I think that the combination of intellect with the personality issues that he had is really interesting. And the quote that Robert Dole had of it's not how his presidency ended that should be the focus, but that he actually had the presidency at all is really interesting to me. So I like getting into these characters, and this guy was a real character, and of course I love reading about, I love reading about Robert Kennedy, one of my favorites, his brother, obviously the president, Reagan, Teddy Roosevelt, who I think was, despite the current view, was the energy, and you talk about enthusiasm and how he approached issues. James Garfield was a really interesting president that not a lot of people know about, that was brilliant and, assassinated, and would have survived if they would have stopped trying to get the bullet out of his back. Really interesting people that were brilliant folks that don't get a lot of like him, that don't get a lot of love, but it's just something I always have one or two on the bedside, and I have a ton on my Kindle that I'm always working on.
I'm the same way. I grew up with a father who was a banker for 30 years, and then basically retired, was on boards and whatnot, and amassed the largest at the time private collection of Teddy Roosevelt books and paraphernalia and campaign and so I grew up with this passion for history like you, and I agree. You've got to find the nuggets out of these stories, because the person isn't perfect. No biographer would tell you the person is perfect, but they are going to give you that great nugget, which will teach you when you're maybe in a comparable situation. So thanks for sharing that. I look forward to you and I breaking bread and having a longer conversation on a number of topics. In fact, I will tell you this before I let you go. The pictures behind you mentioned the Yankees, and I don't know if your dad's still with us, but he might appreciate some of these. That's Babe Ruth with my uncle. My great-grandfather was best friends with Connie Mack, so he traveled 1 month out of the season with the Philadelphia Athletics, sat on the bench, warmed the pictures up, and it just was this kind of amazing. Imagine you and I saying, okay, we're off for August, and going on the road with a baseball team. That's kind of what he did. Crazy
that's
stuff.
Incredible, that picture. I actually figured that was Babe Ruth earlier on the call, but had no idea that looks like, is that Truman in the middle or Roosevelt, but next to Babe Ruth?
No, it's my great-grandfather with his glove. But this is Ty Cobb and Eddie Collins with my great grandfather in his uniform. It's crazy.
I love it. I love it. I'm a Yankees fan, as Whit will tell you. And my father, unfortunately, is not with us anymore. But he played. He was a college baseball player, and growing up in Patterson he was actually a Brooklyn Dodger fan originally, Gil Hodges, and then moved to become a real big Yankees fan when the Dodgers moved to LA. But I love going to Yankees games with Whit. It's a blast.
Well, one day I'd like to join you, and I just want to end by thanking you. Your father obviously really influenced you in so many positive ways. I can see so much coming out of that initial story you told, and I think people are going to really relate to how, you're in such a position of authority and leadership, and you're doing so many important things, both on the transactional litigation side, that someone would presume you must be arrogant and you must be above things. And it's so wonderful to hear that, no, you're in the trenches with people and you're playing that role to serve the broader good. And I from 1 hour with you, I admire you, and I really look forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I totally appreciate it. Thank you for having me, and also obviously looking forward to getting together in person as soon as we can.
Exactly. I hope so too. Well, have a great rest of your week. I'll talk to you soon.
You too. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Matt. Bye.
Bye-bye.